Continuing our series of broadcasts on marriage and broadcasts from the National Alliance for Relationship and Marriage Educators right here in Oklahoma City. We're going to move into a section where we're talking about data of things that are happening and what we can prove and can't prove. And our special guest today is Brad Wilcox. He is the professor of sociology at UVA, and he is the senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. So welcome, Brad.
Good to be here with you, Joseph.
Outstanding. And then, of course, my friend Jerry Angelo is helping me coordinate all these interviews and put them all together, and he had some spice to it as well. So thank you, Jess. You're very welcome. So, Brad, it's probably not an overstatement to say you are an advocate for marriage. What trend do you see marriage taking right now from this point?
Yeah, Joseph, I've got kind of bad news and good news to report to you today. The bad news is kind of for adults, a closing of the American heart unfolding. And we're seeing dramatic declines in dating, dramatic declines in marriage, and dramatic declines in childbearing. That's the bad news. I'm going to talk about why that's bad news in a second. But the good news is that as marriage and family become more selective, we're actually seeing the share of kids who are being raised by their own married parents has been ticking up, right? And so that's just because the kinds of people who are getting married today and having kids today are relatively more religious, relatively more conservative, and relatively more educated, all of which kind of tend to reinforce more stable marriages for those that are being formed today.
So are you saying that we've sort of hit bottom?
That's a great question. I don't think we've hit bottom yet. I think we're going to hit bottom, though. But we have actually, on a different related front, we've hit bottom when it comes, it looks like, to faith in America. So we've been seeing kind of from one generation to the next, more and more kind of Americans saying that they're religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S's. And that's kind of stopped, though, with the Gen Zers. They're actually slightly more religious than the millennials. So my hope is that we're going to see the same thing happening in marriage in the next decade, where kind of the share of Americans who are married is going to hit bottom and then tick up as people kind of understand and appreciate how much this institution matters for them and for their future and for any kids that they'd have.
So let's just go there. Why does it matter?
So marriage matters because despite the fact that a lot of adults today, for instance, think that like your bank account or your career or some hobby might be the most important thing when it comes to fulfillment and happiness, there's nothing that matters more for the average American than a good marriage when it comes to predicting how happy they are with their lives in general. Not sexual frequency, not self-rated health, not job satisfaction. I mean, you kind of name it, and I can kind of crunch numbers. And I will find that if you have a good marriage, that's going to be the kind of top predictor for the average woman and man, in this country today.
For happiness?
For happiness, yeah. But also things like the sense of meaning with your life, not being lonely, financial security. It's often the case that marriage or a family factor is the top predictor. So just another example here, when you look at kind of the American dream and you look at sort of the story for poor kids, what you find is that for poor kids across the U.S., the number one factor that predicts their mobility at the community level is the share of two-parent families in a community. And so that shows us that kids who are, for instance, poor kids being raised in the Salt Lake City area, are much more likely to realize the American dream, become affluent as adults, compared to poor kids in a place like Atlanta, Georgia. And the story there, in part again, is that there are more two-parent families to sort of help superintend them, lift them up, move them up and out, in a place like the Salt Lake City metro area versus a place like the Atlanta metro area.
So we just saw some of that in our lunchtime plenary session. Is that something similar or the same thing?
Yeah, so certainly that's based upon work done by Raj Chetty, an economist at Harvard, that point about the American dream. And others, like I just had another colleague did a study on deaths of despair. We've been seeing, obviously, a lot of people dying by suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol poisoning in this country in recent years. There's been a big spike in these deaths of despair. And a colleague just did a study showing that the biggest factor he found at the regional level was the share of married Americans in a region. So the point being is that when a community has not that many married people, especially working class guys who aren't married, way more likely to succumb to deaths of despair. And by contrast, when there's a lot of married folks in a community, these deaths of despair are much less common. So when people have hope, meaning, direction, their lives are filled with their family and caring for their spouse, got kids, maybe grandkids coming, whatever, that just tends to ground and guide people. When they don't have that, then they can get into a very dark place.
We make all these jokes about marriage. Oh, my wife, the ball and chain, all of this stuff. But truly, by the statistics, none of that is true. We want that. We need that to be happy, right?
Well, and in fairness, obviously, I think we all know married couples who are struggling or married spouses who are struggling. We know single adults who are flourishing. But I'm a sociologist, and so I'm saying that on average, yes, we need that. And on average, we tend to be more likely to be flourishing when we're living for someone else or someone else's in our own household. And just living for ourselves tends to be, for most of us, a dead end.
And wouldn't it be that a healthy model or a healthy venue of marriage where you have not perfect, but healthy? Those are the ones that fit what you're talking about.
That's correct. And again, I think one thing I talk about in my book and Get Married is that there are couples that take kind of more of a me first approach to marriage, and then couples who take more of a we first approach to marriage. And the latter group, the we first folks, are doing a lot better in their marriages, kind of see themselves as a team who are kind of willing to sacrifice, compromise, work together on some common goals and concerns, are much more likely to be flourishing than those husbands and wives who kind of look at marriage more through the prism of what's going to make me happy. What do I want to do in this situation or in this relationship?
So that's interesting. So marriage is sort of this laboratory where people learn how to get out of themselves, turn the focus from themselves to someone else, do it on a daily basis. And then that, all of with biblical influence, all of that true, but increases ultimately their happiness. Is that?
That's exactly right. And there's also a phrase from Aristotle, you talked about we're social animals, right? And so when we have good friendships, good family relationships, part of a community, obviously a community of faith, for instance, we're much more likely to be flourishing because there's so many opportunities to both receive care, give care, have a sense that you're part of something larger than yourself, have a full day, right? Whereas when I talked for this book to women and men in their mid-30s, for instance, who hadn't gotten married, hadn't had kids, and not to a man or not to a woman, but there were plenty of those folks who were just kind of really struggling with empty evenings, empty weekends, having the sense that there was really no one in their corner when life's difficulties came along, and kind of worried about the future too for themselves. And by contrast, if you're married and you got kids and then grandkids down the road, I mean, tends to be pretty full life. Can be a lot of stresses and strains. I'll acknowledge that. I've got a lot of kids, but you don't feel typically all that lonely or that your life is like devoid of meaning when you've got a full family life on the home front.
When Kate and I will do a marriage-related event in a church or wherever, one of the things that I like to say is people try to get fulfillment within themselves, but this is just my opinion. I don't think that we were designed to achieve happiness or joy, however you want to put it, unless we step outside of ourselves and serve someone else. Like, we don't have that capacity within ourselves to truly be happy. But when we're serving someone else for a purpose, let's say like in marriage, I think that's when the true happiness comes into play.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what's striking about the data is it looks like for men especially, and I think from us men it can be harder, but the relationship between kind of marriage and parenthood is a little bit stronger for men in terms of their happiness than it is for women. I think in part because both women are more likely to have other opportunities to kind of be social and be caring for others than men. And then also because I think men need to have a bit more sort of structured arrangements to sort of channel that and to generate that. And so what for a lot of guys, having a wife and having kids just gives them a rich opportunity to live for someone else in a much more reoccurring way.
I never really thought about that until just now, you saying that. I've got a lot of friends, but I also don't have a lot of close friends, right? And I think that's typical for many men. They may have a lot of acquaintances, but their inner circle is pretty compact. But a man has the opportunity, an ample opportunity, to serve his wife and his kids. And I think that maybe go along with what you're saying as far as happiness. They have more opportunity to achieve happiness through their spouse and their kids than maybe they would outside of that circle of life.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
So we're here with Brad Wilcox. He's the author of the book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, ultimately. And I'd like to also say at the bottom of the back cover, people who've recommended the book, Dr. Al Mohler. Brad Wilcox is one of the most important public intellectuals in the world today. He also tells us the truth, and he does so brilliantly in Get Married. That coming from Al Mohler, That means a lot. So thank you for writing the book and for meeting with us today. So let me also now ask you, we've kind of covered what's happening. Why is that happening now?
Yeah, so I think there's been a couple of things that have happened since the 60s. Obviously, one part of the story here is the increasingly secular cast of American life, and faith is an important kind of factor when it comes to generating strong marriages, when it comes to kind of pointing people towards marriage. I think there's also been a turn towards the self. We had the phrase that the 70s was the me generation or the me decade from Tom Wolfe, that famous American writer, and he kind of captured that turn towards the self, which wasn't as conducive to being both getting married and staying married as well. I think we've also seen in our public policies, a lot of our means-tested programs now, like Medicaid, for instance, end up penalizing marriage. And so I've, for instance, talked to a couple of couples, working class couples, where they're not married, they've got a couple of kids, because in part, if they were to get married, they no longer qualify for Medicaid. And so there's just issues there with some of our welfare-related programs. And then the final piece that I mentioned just quickly here is sort of the floundering fortunes of men. And what we're seeing with young men today is too much time on Xbox. You mentioned, Joseph, too much pornography, not enough time spent on in high school or technical school later on down the road or college. And then also not enough young men working full-time in their 20s. And so I think just our schools, big tech, our culture are just not very male-friendly right now. And so that means that as women are looking around in their 20s for a mate, for a boyfriend, and for a husband, they often feel like their options aren't great on that score as well. So I think just the floundering fortunes of men are part of why we're kind of in a place now where marriage currently is in retreat.
Okay, so what can we do about it?
So there's a couple of things I think we can do about it. One is, I think, just trying to communicate to people that marriage is an important good and that we should be doing a better job of preparing our young adults. And so one example is when I talk to my students, I basically encourage them to be as strategic about kind of dating with an eye towards marriage as they are about their careers. And I will talk to I was talking to a young man at my church in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he was also a graduate student at UVA, and he had a very clear plan as I was talking to him about his career. But I said, what's your career for? And I said, do you want to get married? Oh yeah, I want to get married. I'm like, what's your plan to find a spouse? Dead silence, right? It's just encouraging young adults to be as intentional about meeting people, putting themselves in situations where they're going to meet people, going on dates, giving their dating partners a couple of chances, maybe if there's any hope, not being as picky, sort of on the front end, prioritizing what's really important rather than a long list of potential traits that they would want in a spouse, ideally. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing that I would say is to rethink how we're kind of raising up young men in terms of protecting them from too much time on electronics, keeping them involved in sports and hobbies that keep them off devices, trying to offer them a clear and constructive model of masculinity, talking about the importance of getting physically fit, having a real hobby, having a clearer sense of their vocational path, or developing that sense so they can be more attractive as a boyfriend than a husband down the road. Helping them to understand that even today, women are looking for guys generally who are stronger, who are more protective, who are decent providers, who have a certain measure of ambition, but also who are capable of being emotionally present to them and keeping, again, the device on the table. So one wife that I spoke to, for instance, in the South, mentioned that she really appreciated when she and her husband had kind of periods of time when the phones were down and not kind of in use. So kind of equipping men to, again, be kind of what I talk about is providing, protecting, but also paying attention to their wives and children in ways that keep the marriage strong.
So not just some buff dude that's hitting the gym, right? Or
exactly.
Right. There are other things, being more emotionally intelligent in marriage and empathetic and being able to see the true identity of where they were created in the Lord's image.
Okay, that's great, Jerry, but I can tell you as a 20-year-old, the percentage of thought I gave to being emotionally present was zero. I didn't even know what that meant. Well,
I know.
How do you get over?
We have to do a better job of that as parents and educators and men and women of faith, because we're missing the mark. Just like what you said, you asked that young man, what kind of plans do you have for a spouse? Like dead silence. That doesn't happen in the moment. That happens before you're ready to get married.
And I think even kind of like one example of how this would kind of play out in the family is really trying to cultivate an ethic of service on the part of your teenage son. And you can, for families that have done a good job of this, the son is like, the teenage son, he's attentive. Like if they've got guests coming over, he's like asking his parents, what can I do to get the hors d'oeuvres out, or they ask him to clear the table. There's an ethic of service, and that translates, I think, pretty easily into being a decent boyfriend.
It's like he's already thinking outside of himself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In a non-romantic situation.
Right. And engaging in conversation with not just his fellow teenager-y person. Maybe it's a family friend that's an adult, or maybe even a youngster. It takes a more emotionally intelligent kind of person that can have a better experience in that situation, which is going to lead to skills later on.
But I also think too, like I'm guessing, Joseph, of course I didn't know you were in 20, but I'm guessing that you were a more socially adept 20-year-old guy than a lot of guys today, just because you didn't have a cell phone, right? And so
Fair point.
You did a fair bit of talking and relating, and probably, I'm guessing you're a pretty humorous guy. And these would all be things that would be attractive, right, to girls that you were dating.
I wish I'd known that then.
So, but I'm just saying, I think the challenge today is that because our young men are spending so much time on either their phone or on the Xbox, that they're not even developing the basic modicum of social skills that are going to make them more attractive. So I think that's just part of it's just kind of keeping them off the devices too.
But
that'll do something.
Brad, I'm texting and instant messaging and DMing. I mean, I'm communicating, right? Isn't that the best way?
No, I mean, obviously, and that's the way a lot of our teenagers think about things.
Being sarcastic.
Right. But we do know that I think there's something incredibly important about kind of these in-person, conversations that is much more fruitful for friendship and for dating and marriage than just the online stuff, and including just the texting.
So I've heard you use the phrase a couple times now, the closing of the American heart. How does that relate to what we've been talking about?
Well, I think one piece of that is that because of technology, there's not enough kind of in-person socializing between young men, young women, teenage boys, teenage girls, and 20-something men and 20-something women as well. And so that's one factor dragging down opportunities to date. And if people are not going to be dating, it's awfully hard to kind of get to marriage, obviously, and to having kids. So part of the challenge is trying to figure out how do we put the technology in a bit of a box. We're not going to go back to, obviously, 1995 or whatever else it might be, but kind of being more intentional about, as family members, trying to cultivate, like when you come into the kitchen, you just dump the phone in the corner, and encouraging some habits of self-control that will be better for us as spouses and parents, and also for our kids, so they can develop these social skills that'll make them better, better boyfriends and girlfriends, and more willing and able to date and marry and have kids together. So that's part of what I would say. Beyond the point about young men, I think also in terms of changing public policies so they're more marriage friendly. So one example is eliminating that marriage penalty that's in a lot of our welfare-related programs, right? But even, I think, moving in a more aggressive way to, like, for instance, there's a child tax credit out there. We could have a marriage bonus that would kind of like push the culture in a more marriage-friendly direction. I think there's going to be some talk next year in Texas of adding a tax property benefit for married parents with kids in the household. So anyways, I think just being open to a new way of thinking about family policy. I think a lot of conservatives are like committed to a limited government perspective, which I think makes sense in the main, but there could be ways in which we could kind of be more forward thinking in trying to get marriage in people's minds and hearts and even bank accounts in ways that would move the dial too.
So that you kind of spoke to the sort of the public policy level there quite a bit. One thing I'm having difficulty understanding, and I'd love to hear your answer during our interview here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, but when I was dating way back when, you probably were too.
Can you remember that far back?
Oh, man, seriously. When you go on a date with that girl, there's a serious dopamine hit there. So it doesn't seem like it would be all that difficult to get that started, get the engine going.
But it's a risk, right? And so I think there's the risk of rejection. I think that's a big part of the story here is that, and Jonathan Haidt is this great psychologist who's written a book called The Anxious Generation. He's also written a bunch of other things. And in that book, he just talks about how we're kind of basically helicoptering over our kids these days, not giving them opportunities to do a lot of risky things, both physically and otherwise. And so if you haven't had that experience of going to get a job on your own as a teenager, or spending the day navigating some forest or some whatever trail somewhere on your own, you're just not used to kind of putting yourself out there, right? Then when it comes to dating, I think it's going to be harder for the average teenage boy, young man to kind of screw up the courage to ask someone out in person. And yet we know from, I poll my kids at UVA, but I've seen studies too, women tend to prefer that the guy makes the first move, even today. And so it'd be better if we could encourage our young men to take that initiative and ask her out.
It must be getting pretty bad when Mike Rowe's talking about Chick-fil-A having a camp to teach some of these soft skills like what you're talking about to these, and it may not even be future employees. They just want to help that effort because I think we've sunk so low and we're doing a bad job at that. And Chick-fil-A, fast food company, is stepping in there where we should be doing that.
Yeah, that's a
As
very
a
important.
society.
Exactly. Or even as our churches. Are there things churches can do to influence people?
Oh, yeah, we got to be getting in there and doing this.
So, I mean, I think obviously youth groups where there's like phone-free time is obviously part of the answer, but I think trying to encourage parents to be even more aggressive about revisiting their technology policy. So we have a lot of kids, and we made the mistake of giving our older kids iPhones. And now, but with our middle kids who are 14 years old, they have simple phones. So no internet, no social media, and it's much better for them and for us as parents. So I think we've got to get more parents kind of rethinking how they approach something like a smartphone.
That's a great way to do it too. So their phones have the buttons on them. They have to actually push.
Well, they look like a smartphone, but they can call and text their friends, but they can't get on the internet and they can't get on social media.
Gotcha.
And I'm sure that's a challenge for them because their friends probably have that. But I think in the long run, that's going to be a major benefit for them.
Yeah, that's exactly our thought. Definitely.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
It's a long game.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So once again, we're talking with Brad Wilcox here, author of the book, Get Married, and I highly recommend everyone get a hold of that. Where can they find this?
It's on Amazon and HarperCollins. I guess one other point I think for your audience is there's been a lot of negative messaging lately about faith in family, even faith in marriage. There's a big New York article that was kind of saying that Christian guys were hung up on pornography and their wives were upset with them and all this kind of totally negative message about the impact of like faith on evangelical Christian men and couples. Totally neglected the big story, and that is that generally speaking, church-going couples are more happily married. They are more stably married, much more stably married, and they have a lot more sex and they're more sexually satisfied today than secular couples. And the sexual frequency piece is fascinating. It's new. It used to be no difference by religion and when it came to sexual frequency for couples, but today something is in the water where religious couples are having a lot more sex than secular couples. So totally kind of missing the boat on the big picture here for faith and family in the U.S. today.
Yeah, exactly. So, Jerry, what would be your final comments here?
Well, go and get this book called Get Married by Brad Wilcox. He's an amazing researcher, and I'm real proud of you, and I'm thankful to call you a friend. And he's devoted his life to this work, and I think that there's a lot of great stuff in there that we can all learn from.
Amen. All right. Very good. We've got 1 minute left. Can you give our listeners kind of a charge to go on?
One word I talk about a lot in the book is at the end is the word courage. And just to kind of remind people that, look, there's a lot of evidence that kind of backs up our worldview when it comes to marriage and family. But I think we've had a lack of courage when it comes to bringing that message to our neighbors, to maybe our adult kids who are a little bit distant from the faith, to the local school board, whatever it might be, to our place of business, right? And just to kind of understand and appreciate that the science, if you will, is generally on our side on a lot of these big questions and issues. And we just need to be more confident, more courageous to kind of share the truth about marriage and family with the wider world around us.
God's message to Joshua, be strong and courageous. Him calling Gideon a mighty man of valor, Christian men. Let's be courageous together. Thank you, Brad Wilcox, for being with us today and sharing a half hour of your time here at the conference. Thanks again, Jerry, also for being here. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.